Hi everyone, Lou Burrows here and welcome back to the show. Before we dive into today's episode, I would just love to share with you that this episode and this podcast is brought to you by Riverside. And like quite literally, I use Riverside to connect with guests and record podcast episodes I bring to you every single week. I love Riverside for so many different reasons, including their community, which is available on Discord and Facebook. Their suite of AI tools, including AI show notes, magic clips, and how easy it is to use the platform. If you are a podcaster, creator, I would highly recommend getting onto Riverside and using the platform to record all of your content using the platform. To get started today, all you need to do is click on the link in the show notes of this episode and use code Luke Burrows, that's code Luke Burrows, my name, easy to remember, for 15% off your subscription. I would just also like to say thank you to Riverside for providing me with this discount for you guys, as I know it's going to help a lot of you to get on the platform and start to see the amazing benefits and transformation that using Riverside will have for all of your content creation. Let's get started creating with Riverside. Now, moving on to today's episode. In this episode, we are joined by Jesse Coomer, who is the founder of the Breathwork Tactics program and the author of a practical guide to breathwork and the language of breath. In this episode, we discuss breathwork through the lens of its relationship with our unconscious, subconscious, and conscious mind. I had a fascinating time exploring this and talking with Jesse, and I'm so pleased that I'm able to now bring and share the episode with you. So I'm not going to hang around, we're just going to dive straight into this episode and explore breathwork, in particular through the lens of its relationship with our subconscious, our unconscious, and our conscious mind, and actually what this means for our day-to-day life. So let's dive into it. Jesse, welcome to Raising Consciousness. How are you doing today?
Doing great. Thanks for having me.
Welcome. You're welcome. I discovered your work on LinkedIn, and although I have covered breathwork, which I know your teachings are rooted in, a few times on the podcast, I liked your approach to breathwork. I liked what you were sharing. I liked the basically your work, and what I really wanted to bring you onto the podcast to discuss your work, the why behind your work, the science behind your work, and actually its relationship a lot more with performance as well. Obviously, with you working, what it seems, from with a lot of high performers and people who are at the top of their game. So before we dive into all of that, would love to learn a little bit more about yourself for those who aren't familiar with your work, and I guess who is Jesse and why do you do what
Jesse
you do?
Coomer? Yes. Yeah. All right. Well, yeah. So yeah, my name is Jesse Coomer, and I am a health and human performance specialist, but I do focus mostly in breath work and temperature training. When I train individuals, it's a holistic approach that is founded in what is the most foundational thing that we do, and that is breathing. And this is sort of a long time coming for me. I think one of the things I've struggled with my whole life is this strange combination of being, on the one hand, a very extroverted person, and on the other hand, being someone who has suffered from social anxiety for my entire life. So the thing that really brought me a lot of joy was the same thing that really brought me a lot of stress and anxiety. And I didn't understand how any of this really works. And I don't think most people do. There's a lot of junk advice and a lot of misunderstandings about what we are as a human being that is at the foundation. And when you start with a misunderstanding, it doesn't matter how good the thinking is from that point on, it's flawed because you have a misunderstanding from the ground up. And so this has affected me and brought me to all kinds of negative behaviors throughout my life, and trying to deal with what I didn't understand, which was this anxiety, this stress, these things like that. And it wasn't like I was living through terrible times. I had pretty much a run of the mill, I had a good childhood and things like that. But still, there was a lot of these things that they they were difficult for me to deal with. And at the time, I didn't really understand what they were. Now I do. And now that's what I that's at the foundation of my trainings. But what happened to me is that of course, I went down a lot of wrong paths. And in my I would say my mid to late 20s, I was really trying to get a handle on things. So I started this thing that people talked about called exercise, started to do a lot of things that were difficult, that didn't have immediate, you press the button and you get the pleasure type of things. It was ultimately starting to work with what I am. And at some point, a friend of mine was like, hey, you know what? You really should try meditation because you're just this anxious, hyper person. You should try meditation. So I tried to do meditation. I said, okay, I'm going to sit here and meditate as long as I can. And I closed my eyes and I, crossed my legs and sat in what I felt was the most meditative pose possible. And I meditated as long as I could. And 5 seconds later, I opened my eyes. It was one of those things where I was like, okay, I have to figure something out. So I started to do research, and this is what led me into breath work. And this is what really changed my whole life. And while I train in a lot of different modalities, and I use that with my clients in a lot of different ways, I found that the breath work was so foundational, and it led me to do a lot of research. Now, another thing people should know about me is that I am a recovering English professor. I was an English professor for 11 years, and and during this time is whenever I developed my own philosophy of breath work, is when I did a lot of research. And the thing is, you can be okay. So just to give everybody an idea, you can be a English professor in a lot of different ways. So you can be an English professor that focuses on literature, and I did teach a little bit of literature, but my primary focus in being an English professor was research and rhetoric. So ultimately, exactly what I am. I just nerd about things that I'm interested in, how to do quality research, basically, and then how to explain it to other people in words that they would understand. So how to make this stuff understandable. And so, this is ultimately what a teacher does. So I was a teacher at the college level for 11 years, doing a lot of these things. As I was doing this research, I started to understand that we have some fundamental misunderstandings about what we are as a human. And a lot of it has to do with the language that we use to describe ourselves, which is rooted in those misunderstandings. And so, for instance, one of the biggest misunderstandings that we often will think about is actually rooted in something. It's rooted in metaphors that we use. So we use metaphors all the time. We use metaphors, every language, people just think in metaphors. It's like this, it's like that. So for instance, when we think about food, we think about this is a building block, right, of your body, or it is fuel for your body, right? So we think about these things in those ways. Now, is it fuel or is it a building block, right? These are helpful, but there comes a time when the metaphor does break down, but the metaphor is better than nothing. And in the case of thinking about what a human being is, the metaphor that we often use now is that we are a machine, right? And this is much better than what we used to think about ourselves. We used to think we were just basically a sack of fluids. In my book, The Language of Breath, I talk about the longest holding misconception in all of medicine. For 2,500 years, we believed that the human organism was basically a sack of 4 fluids. And this was a practice called humorism. And if your humors were out of, alignment, then you would either, you could become sick, or you could become mentally ill, or, and this is where a lot of what we know, it's interesting. It was better than the previous thing that we had, which was just like, hey, if you get sick, it's you're smited by God, right? That was the diagnosis. So at least this was trying to understand the human organism in a way that was, okay, maybe there's something going on inside, but 2,500 years is a long time. And we still have a lot of these concepts that are pervasive in the world now. For instance, if your humors were to get too cold, then you were going to catch a cold. That's where that comes from humorism. We know now that simply being cold doesn't make you sick. It can, but there is a relationship between being cold and being sick, but it's different than what we originally thought. So we continuously progress in how we understand things. And as we do, we use different metaphors. And so moving into, of course, humorism lasted up until the mid 1800s when we started to look at the human organism a bit differently. And of course, during that time, we had a lot of machines, right? This is the Industrial Revolution. And we started to notice germ theory. And a great metaphor, especially compared to you're a sack of fluids, is you're a machine, right? Because, you got pulleys, you got levers, you can visualize some energy centers as sort of like the power plant of your machine or your battery or whatever. And it's a great metaphor. But it's the thing that happens so often with metaphors is that we focus so much on the metaphor that we almost forget it's a metaphor. We just start looking at it as, okay, so the human body is a machine. How can we understand the human body through that metaphor only? And this is something that will often lead us to think about ourselves as this master of the machine. And maybe it's of course, it also leads to another pervasive misunderstanding is that we are a mind that drives around a body, kind of like you own a Buick and you drive it around. And this comes from what we call mind-body dualism, which is another thing that has pervaded all throughout history. And these are not bad. They're just not quite as accurate as we know now. And so Rene Descartes, who was famous for I think therefore I am, and he was also the one who ultimately we attribute mind-body dualism. He also compared the human organism to a machine. One of the things that he said is that the mind and the body are different because the mind is indivisible. You can't divide the mind, but in the body, you got a bunch of parts. Now, in the 21st century, we know that's not true. We know that we have conscious processes, but we have a lot of unconscious processes. And that at all times, and just right now, we are having what we believe, what feels like a singular experience, but it's actually the combination of multiple unconscious experiences, unconscious processes that are combined with our conscious awareness. In fact, only about 5% of what's happening in our brain is conscious activity. The other 95% of what's happening in our brain is unconscious activity. And that's as much of you as the conscious part of us that we often attribute to, hey, this is who I am. And so looking back on my life, I wish I would have known a lot about this. And this is one of the big missions that I bring to my clients. And I want to talk about, we were talking about high performance here in a minute, but just as a kind of a groundwork of my basic philosophy, once you start to understand that you are a conscious and unconscious being, that the mind and body really is all the same thing, it's just that we experience it in these two different ways, then you can start to understand stress, anxiety, social anxiety, whatever anxieties you have in a better way. Because then you start to understand, well, okay, I am an organism. I'm 37.2 trillion cells. That's what the human organism is. And that organism has a survival plan. And while my conscious thinking me knows that I'm in the year 2024 and that I can't go run away or attack something whenever I come up to a stressor, the unconscious me, it's still going with the old game plan. And that is for every kind of action or for every kind of stressor or situation, the way we approach that is through taking physical action. So when I was a kid or whenever I was a teenager and I had anxiety and I had, stress, and so this also is in every arena, right? So when human beings feel stress, when they feel anxiety, it's not the boogeyman. It feels like the boogeyman, right? It feels like, oh my God, there's stress and it's coming in on me. And in reality, what it is, there's a part of you that loves you very much. And it is trying to give you energy to take physical action because it believes that's the most important thing to do right here and now. So you can be sitting at your desk and maybe you've got a deadline or you've got some kind of a boss that's mad at you or something like that. And you're feeling what we call stress. And really what that is, it's the strain of all of this energy that suddenly is starting to be produced. That's what that is. It's ultimately energy that you can't use, right? It's not like you can just jump up and tackle. You shouldn't, at least. I guess you could tackle your boss, but you shouldn't probably. So you have to sit there and you're shaking and you're trying to do your work and you're trying to type at your desk. And what you're dealing with is this enormous amount of energy that a part of you that loves you very much is giving you because it believes that's the best thing to do right now. And so having this misunderstanding as far as what we are, that's ultimately what led me to the language of breath philosophy. That's my philosophy of breath. And when you start to understand yourself with a better foundation, as opposed to a lot of the metaphors we've used over the course of history, then you can start to say, okay, now that I have a better understanding of what's happening here, I can build off of that new, better understanding. Now, maybe later we'll find out that there's a better way of looking at it. But the way that I understand the human organism now and the way that I teach is less of a master and slave or like a your operator of a vehicle, right? Mind driving around the body, and more as you are a relationship. And this conscious and unconscious relationship is what we're managing internally as we're trying to manage the relationship between ourselves and the world around us. And once you start from there, then we can start to build on how does breathing interface with this relationship, as opposed to the way I even used to look at breath work, which was, well, if I breathe this way, it's like typing in a code for my machine, right, to do this thing. It's not really that way. And it led to a lot of frustration. It leads a lot of other breath practitioners to frustration because that's still the pervasive way we look at things. But when you start to see yourself as a relationship, then you realize, okay, it's not all about control. It's about learning how to form a better relationship so I can start relying on my partner, which is this unconscious part of me. So I guess that's a long way of getting around to it, but that's ultimately who I am and sort of the foundation of my message.
So is seeing ourselves in like that relationship or the human experience or human beings as a relationship, is that the metaphor per se that we're to see ourselves kind of through? Or because I was actually going to ask what are some better metaphors, but then obviously you shared around the relationship. So it sounds like that's a better kind of lens to see us through. Would that be correct?
Yeah, it's very difficult to conceptualize something complex without a metaphor to hold that place. So, for instance, when physicists try to explain to, people like myself, I'm not a physics guy, right? I like watching, documentaries about physics and string theory. And so I cannot calculate force and, friction and all. I took it in college, but I hated every second of it, right? But whenever they try to explain to us something so complex as the atom, right? So okay, and that's a really it's difficult to explain it without a metaphor, right? So a lot of times they'll explain it almost kind of like it's a solar system, or like there's balls together and there's things that the electrons are like balls that kind of float around. These are metaphors too for something that's incredibly complex. And so when we're looking at the human organism, it's going to be pretty much impossible to not use a metaphor. It's just that I think the best way to see it is a relationship as opposed to a driver of a machine. And you can think of this for multiple reasons. One is I think it's more accurate just in general. I mean, and knowing what we know now, as opposed to when this metaphor really started taking off, we know a lot more about what we are as human beings. we know that everything within us affects everything else. It's not just like, okay, I have this little man up here that has the gears and then, okay, that's what does this. And then there's nothing else. We understand the vast majority of us is unconscious. And this unconscious is not just in charge of making sure your heart beats and that your blood flows. Your unconscious is constantly sending you signals and messages. And this is the foundation of the language of breath. We want to become more aware of these signals and messages so we can start to interplay with this other part of ourselves, because it's not something other than you. And so this is another thing that we have to get our heads around. It's very difficult, right? Again, I just used another metaphor, constantly using metaphors to communicate, right? So we got to get our heads around this because it's more than just what's in our head, right? We understand that there is literally mind in every cell in the human organism. Our mitochondria are just incredibly, how is it that they know what to do? Well, these are all unconscious processes. But primarily, I look at the unconscious as it relates to our minds or our brains, I should say, because we have the conscious mind, right? And then we have the unconscious. And this is not just the subconscious. This is also all the different aspects that make up you. And we know that when this part of you is active, and actually just to give a little primer as far as just the complexity of what that even looks like. So at every moment of every day, we're taking in about 11 million pieces of information. So we're constantly processing information, but you can only consciously process about 40 or 50 pieces of information at a time, right? So a lot of times, another metaphor we use for our brains is a computer, right? We got this supercomputer. Like, we use metaphors all the time, and it's not a bad metaphor, but it tends to make us think about ourselves as if we are more machine than what we really are, which is more biology. The unconscious you is processing an enormous amount of information, and you're not even aware of it. So we don't even have conscious awareness of all the information that our unconscious is processing until it decides to let us know. And when that happens, when the unconscious says, okay, we need to kick something up to conscious awareness, then it manifests itself in many different ways. Sometimes it's not going to directly make itself known to conscious awareness. So for instance, you might have to do what we call, we have to observe our inner awareness. So we use what's called interoception, which is our ability to become more aware of our internal state. So for instance, one of the things that I talk about in my book and on the online course, and one of the things that we work with a lot in the teacher training. So if a person wants to become a language of breathworker, there's a whole pathway for that. But one of the things we discuss is, okay, so there are physiological processes that will change depending on what the unconscious believes your situation to be. And this is one of the, it's not incredibly easy to master this. It's a lot of us believe we're really in tune, and you can be doing yoga every day, meditation, stuff like that. And it takes it's actually not just a given that you're really in tune with yourself. But one of the first things we start to notice is physiological changes. So the easiest one is your heart rate, because it's actually a jiggling thing in your body, right? So you actually have this heart, and you can start to notice, wow, my heart rate is high when I am under stress or whenever I'm in a stressful situation. Oh, okay, it's lower when I'm relaxed. Well, that is your unconscious. You didn't consciously decide to make that happen, but the unconscious is saying, okay, because I'm detecting through all this complex processing that we're in a stressful situation, possibly dangerous situation, could be exciting too. It could be an exciting, it doesn't have to be a bad thing, right? It can just be that you're really excited. You know, it's Christmas Eve, right? Christmas Eve. I mean, who can sleep on Christmas Eve when you're a kid? And that's because you're excited. The unconscious says, hey, we're going to need energy to take some kind of physical action here. Well, we start to notice those physiological responses. That's one way. Another thing that happens, the unconscious will send you what we call feelings and emotions, right? So at all times, you're always having an emotional experience. And a lot of times when we talk about emotions, we act like, oh, it's just, that's what you talk to with the psychologist and whatever, which is true. But at all times, you're always having emotions, and emotions have a biological function, and that is to move you to take some kind of action in a very powerful way. And so when we become aware of those, we start to say, okay, wow, those we call them feelings. And there are actual physical sensations that accompany those. So with the language of breath, we learn how to decipher those messages. That's the foundation of the language of breath. We learn how to decipher really what is the unconscious saying right now? What does it believe about our situation? And that can be gut. Sometimes we call that gut responses, or it's what the heart says, or but basically, what is it that my unconscious believes about this situation? And then how can I speak back to that unconscious me and work as a team to create the best overall state of mind, physiological state for that situation? And that's what we do when we train people with high performance. Because you have to understand, there's a few things that we tend to overlook when we talk to people in high performance. And this can be in sport. I train athletes. It can be in business. I have a lot of my clients that are CEOs, COOs, entrepreneurs, business leaders. And generally it is, strangely enough, the things that make you great are often the things that drive you crazy. So this is the thing that I keep seeing over and over again. And I see it in myself. I see it in other people too. Is, let's suppose you're a person. Let's suppose a lot of times I'll be training a CEO or someone who is a business leader, and they got there because they have certain traits, certain unconscious processes that drive them to action. It's not just like you read a instruction manual and then suddenly you're a business leader or you're a leader in a field. There are unconscious processes that are based that you're not really even consciously aware of that won't let you not do the thing that makes you great. They push you there using emotional responses, using all these things, using bias, cognitive biases, using how you might even perceive the situation. If there's a market shift, if there's a person that you're doing business with and you just got a gut feeling, those are all unconscious signals, right? And the thing is, those will direct your actions. And so we love to think that our decisions are based in, well, I just think through the logic and I do the math and that's how I make my decision. But we know that's not really the case. There is so much research that says that's not the case. And if you just search your feelings, you know it's not the case. We're combinations. We do use logic, but the vast majority of even how we apply logic is affected by these unconscious processes. A lot of times we might call these things our emotional state. So what happens is maybe you have a person who's a leader in a field, whether it's sport, whether it's business or whatever, and that person has a lot of traits that move them to take action, and those actions have led them to this point. But the problem is they've never learned how to form a better relationship with that part of themselves. And so as a result, that thing that makes them great is also driving them crazy. It's the thing that won't let them sleep. It's the thing that keeps them up at night. It's the thing that won't, it gets in the way of them enjoying family time. It gets in the way of them even maybe having relationships. One of the most common things that I'll see, this is usually after I've worked with a person for a while, is that they're very successful in maybe their business life or in their athletic life or some of their other pursuits, but that they're lacking in so many other things. Well, the good news is, it's always, the nice thing is I always get to give people the good news. The good news is there's nothing really wrong with you. It's just that this team that is you, this relationship that is you, just needs some tweaking. We just need to work on how this team works together. And we can do that using two major things in the language of breath. It's not just breath work, right? That is how we speak to the unconscious. That is how we send messages. We also receive messages, and we have to learn how to become more aware of those and understand what they mean and how we can interpret those. And also how those messages do affect our breathing as well. So it's all a relationship. And once we start to learn how to speak and how to decipher what is being said, then we start to see really incredible results, because it's not just a person having to depend on this technique or that technique to get them through the day. We start to actually see progress in just how a person feels overall. So this applies to athletes, this applies to business leaders, this applies to anyone, really. I mean, it's just a human thing, because we're coming at it from a better foundational view than you need to get control over yourself, because that's not really the best way to look at ourselves.
Fascinating, man. Like, I got so many questions. I guess the first is that we've spoken a lot about the mind and the body. My understanding of also with breathwork is that it can help us to connect us to our quote unquote spirit, right? So where does our spirit or our soul, or like whatever terminology we want to use, come into this conversation of what we're talking about? Is that also part of your work, if that makes sense as well?
So that's, I appreciate the question. When it comes to what I do, and in the world of breathwork, you get a lot of people that are very spiritual and that they will have answers for you. I don't feel comfortable trying to be a spiritual guide, and I don't think it's my place. And I honestly, I question whether it's a breathworker's place, and I'll tell you why. And this is something that it's another thing, because I practiced breathwork from a lot of different practices. I went and trained all kinds of places, all kinds of different practices. And what you will find is that breathwork there's certain elements that you're working with. And because and most of the time you'll find in breathwork, we're accidentally tripping over this conscious and unconscious part of you, okay? So you'll accidentally, without knowing, and I think this is what's happened for the vast majority of breath work, you make this connection with the unconscious. When you actually do that, when you really make this connection with yourself in a very profound way, it's a very profound experience. And there is a sensation of familiarity and otherness when you actually connect with your unconscious. Okay, familiarity, because it is you. It literally is you. It's just a part of yourself that you don't normally have a great connection with. It's a bit other because, again, it's a part of you that you don't actually have complete access to. So it's not like you're completely experiencing that fullness of your unconscious, but it's a part of you that you actually, you're starting to know in a more profound way. And it can bring forth things that seem to be what we would attribute to spiritual experiences. And it's very easy to say, well, this was a spiritual experience. And what you should do is, let me tell you about what you should do with your life and who you really are. And all you got to do is follow my way. And guess what? I'll lead you to spiritual enlightenment. And I think it's really dangerous because so many people get into breath work looking for that. You do have amazing experiences, but I would say that, when it comes to spirituality, sometimes it depends on what you define as spirituality. So for instance, in much of the research, there's research that is like, how does this affect a person's their spirituality? And they have to define spirituality. And so if you define spirituality, and I would say you could define it as saying appreciating the uniqueness of existence. Okay, sure. Breathwork is a fantastic way to do that. Having said that, I get very skeptical when I hear people talking about source, when I hear people talking about, do this breath work and you're going to, download information, because I understand from experience and research what really is happening. And when you put a person into an altered state, okay, which you can do through breath work, you may start to have what we call waking dreams, which will feel like I'm receiving a vision, right? And in reality, what's happening is you're experiencing ultimately the same dreamlike state that you would experience when you're asleep, but you're experiencing now because of breath work. And someone who I think a lot of people are very well-meaning in the world of breath work when it comes to this, and they've got great intentions. But we all know what road is paved with good intentions, right? And we see so many people saying, hey, I'm going to guide you to spirit. There's a great desire for that, especially in the West with the decline of traditional religions. A lot of people are looking for answers, and they'd like to feel like they have some kind of a connection to spirituality and religion and God. But they don't want to go to church. So they go to the person, and you'll even see this in breathwork, people wearing robes. They'll have all of the trappings that a person unconsciously associates with religion, and they'll take the place of that, and they'll pass the plate around as many times as they can. They're trying to take that place. And so I'm very skeptical of how modern breathwork often takes this spiritual tone. I think that it's something that it's not my place. And what gives a breathworker the right to guide you to some kind of spiritual ends or means? Breathwork is a fantastic way to communicate with this amazing miracle that's yourself. I think that's pretty profound. I think a lot of times we attribute spirituality to things that are profound and probably have, some metaphysical, like deeper reality that we don't understand. But we're all too eager. And this is something that I've learned about the unconscious through research. And I think that people need to understand more of. We're all too eager to attribute something that's complex and profound to something that's simple, because we really don't want to think about it. And it's not because we're lazy. It's because the unconscious, we have to understand this unconscious you is, it got us to this point in history. And this unconscious you seeks out a simple answer, because that is, if you can find a simple answer, it takes less calories and less time that you could be spending on survival. And so it's just built into the human experience to want to buy a simple answer that we want to hear because I had this profound experience. And so when it comes down to it, I know for some people that might be disappointing to hear me say, but I see this in breath work a lot. And while we used to understand things in that spiritual way only, and this is the heritage of breath work too, right? So if you look back into ancient pranayama, and I've studied this, right? And I think this was the best way to understand it at the time. But just as we used to understand the human organism as a whole bunch of, 4 different fluids that work together, and we have to understand that the practice of humorism was based on the belief that we're created by different forces of the universe, like fire, earth, wind, all these foundational things that we know now, or at least I think we know now. I always take, and the problem is with our unconscious, we don't know we're wrong when we're wrong, right? So maybe I'm wrong, but based off of what I've seen and everything I have done with research, I think so much of breath work can be, I think it's actually more profound to see ourselves as this relationship that we can understand and get to know than having to attribute it to something outside of ourselves.
So it sounds like, because like so often, as I think we're kind of alluding to, breathwork is caught up within like the message of spirituality. For somebody so I got into breathwork through the practice of meditation, and there's kind of like this symbiotic relationship of, oh, that's a spiritual practice. Obviously, like I've then come to realize like it's so much more than that. There's obviously the biological kind of component to it. Obviously learning here today so much more about like the subconscious processes that kind of happen within breathwork, and a part of that to connect with our unconscious self. So it sounds like it's not that it maybe can't lead to some sort of quote unquote spiritual experience. It's that when we hear the messaging constantly of being guided in that way, then that sometimes can be quote unquote dangerous in a way, because it's more than that. And I guess what I'm kind of also hearing is, at the end of the day, like a spiritual experience is a personal experience, right? So like somebody outside of us to say, you know, if you do breath work, this experience is going to happen. Like, how do they actually know that, right? Like, so,
Sure.
so
Well,
yeah, I think it's an interesting kind of topic to kind of bring up because there is that
yeah.
symbiotic relationship between the two.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the things where, because of the sort of the foundations, right? The historical foundations of breath work and meditation being that you can trace them. And this is not just in one religion or two religions. A lot of religions embodied how breath worked to create a different state, and used meditative practices and things like that. And so that is fantastic. I think there's a few things that I guess I want people to know. And that is, one is that you don't have to be religious or spiritual or non-spiritual. Breathwork is your birthright. And I see so many people that are kind of turned off from breathwork because they believe it's a sort of the new age practice. And it's like, well, dude, I'm Christian, or I'm Muslim, or I'm whatever. And I don't want to get into that because I already have a spiritual practice. And I want you to understand that that's not it. And maybe it is for other breathwork practices. So I don't want to speak for other breathwork practices. And I do think that that is what many breathwork practices are attempting to accomplish. So when it comes to language of breath, when it comes to my philosophy of breathwork, it's not anti-spiritual, but it's not, there's no spiritual trappings to the language of breath.
It's like for you, it's more resulted in an understanding or the subconscious or unconscious processes and behaviors to enhance our performance, and like how
it's a way. And it's not just a hack, right? It's a way of understanding yourself. And I think it's pretty profound, right? It's not just for performance. It's not just for this one or two goals, right? It's ultimately, how do we understand ourselves so we can learn to live with ourselves, so we can have a better relationship within ourselves, so we can have a better relationship with the outside world. If I don't understand what I am, and I don't understand how I work, how can I treat myself well? And if I don't treat myself well, how can I treat the world well? I'm going to feel terrible. I'm going to not be able to sleep. And I think so many of the problems that we face, and the problems that led me to where I am in breathwork, originated from me not understanding what I'm all about. I was told, and I think most of us, okay, you've got this machine and you're an operator of a machine. And maybe you were told that your problems were of a spiritual nature. Maybe your anxieties were because you are not on the right spiritual path, or something like that, maybe. But the reality is that much of, I would say most of the experiences we have, you can trace back to the conscious and the unconscious and how these things work together. And now, is that miraculous? Is that something that's pretty profound and may have spiritual roots, and maybe it was put here divinely? Sure. But I think so often in the world of breath work, we get a lot of, hey, the thing that you felt was this thing. And if you, right. And it's labeled in a way that leans toward a spiritual worldview. And I want people to understand that you don't have to have that. You can be a Christian, you can be a Buddhist, you can be an atheist, and you can have an incredibly profound breathwork experience and get to know yourself in a very deep way. And then you can also have these other philosophical or spiritual or religious beliefs on top of that. It's literally learning to be what we are. What is it that we actually are? And then, okay, that doesn't have to or be affected by your spiritual side. And I just personally, I don't feel like I'm the arbiter of spiritual truth, and I don't really want to try to be a guru of any kind. I think that if we can learn at least how all of this works here, maybe we're working with spiritual things. Maybe we're working with this divine, beautiful creation. Well, let's at least learn how to work with this thing. And then if you want to attribute it to a specific spiritual belief, whether it is you believe in religion or spirituality or whatever, that's fine too. But what I often see, and actually when I was writing my book, The Language of Breath, my editor, she said, well, the only breath work that I've ever done was when I was a kid. We were in a cult. And the thing is, cults use breath work because it creates a profound experience. And then you could say, hey, that experience, here, follow me. Right? So it's important to be really aware that when you use breath work, especially the kind of breath work, now, not all the breath work I use is altered state. I only use some of that slightly. But some breath work can create a non-ordinary state of consciousness. And then if you have a person who is trying to sell you on an idea or a specific belief system, you become more suggestible. So I do want to warn people about that. And that is something you will never find in the language of breath work. And I don't always think that, it's not like it sounds sinister, but I don't think people are sinister when they do this. People tend to, when you have a strong belief, it's not like they're saying, I'm an evil villain. It's just that, okay, I'm going to use this breath work. I'm going to give them this profound experience. And then from there, I can attach I warn people against that sort of thing. And that's one thing we never do in the language of breath. So our main focus is saying, okay, so what is it this unconscious you is trying to say? And if the word unconscious sounds super spiritual, just know that it's not. We understand that we have so much of what we are that is intelligent that we don't have conscious access to. And that's literally, when I say the unconscious, that's what I'm talking about. And how that interfaces with the world around us, how it interfaces with your conscious experience, that's what we're concerned with. And when we start to work with this, we start to see, like you said, performance improvements. We start to see athletes that can go harder, stronger, longer, who have the ability to focus far more sharply than they've ever focused before. We see people in business who are able to have much better performance in their business, but also go home and have a beautiful life with their family or form better relationships, get a date now and then, and not just be so stuck in that one area. So it's something that I would encourage you, whether you're religious, whether you're spiritual, whether you're none of the above. The language of breath work philosophy is not going to interfere with how you see spirituality.
It's interesting. So I was having a conversation with a guest a few episodes ago, and we were talking about spiritual matters, except defining it. For them, and I'm bringing this up because there's some kind of parallels with what we're talking about here. They were saying that for them, it means kind of like turning the unconscious conscious and like becoming more of like who they're, and then like through that, like realizing who they truly are, rather than like all of these labels and beliefs and stuff that get passed down onto them through like society and social conditioning, etc. It's like kind of moving all that to one side to actually realize who they truly are, like stepping into that and being more of who they are in the world. And it sounds, I don't know, like that came up as you were talking through there, like there is some kind of parallels there, but I understand in terms of actually your methodology isn't caught up in some sort of ideology. It's helping people to process kind of all of the unconscious and stuff that directs some of our behaviors, but obviously we're not aware to. So I would love to kind of get your kind of 2 cents on that. But also a question I had was centered around, so sometimes I get caught up in, like, I guess you could call it anxiety or worry, being aware of all of the things you're unaware of, right? So like, as we're talking through here, it's like, okay, so there's like a part of me that is aware of like all of this stuff, not actually in terms of details, but like I understand like this, as we're talking about here, like the subconscious mind, right? So I'm like, oh shit, all of those things I'm unconscious of, how they affecting how I show up in life in a way, like how they affecting my relationships, how they affecting me on this podcast today, how they're affecting how I connect with others, how they're affecting me in business. And within that, maybe because sometimes I'm an overthinker, right, causes some sort of stress and anxiety, right? So what would your advice be to, or recommendation be to somebody like me who is very much invested in personal growth, self-transformation, etc., understands that we have this unconscious part of us, and whereas this unconscious part of us is directing, it was having an influence over my life. And kind of how do I then start to do I even need to bring like awareness to that? Yeah, so it's, yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I get where you're going with this. So one of the first things whenever I first got into this and really started to say, oh, wait a minute, there's more to me than just the conscious part of me. And at first, that's when we sometimes start thinking about, okay, do I have free will? Do I have the ability to make decisions that I want to make? How can I get control over my unconscious, right? And again, we are all about control, right? And so my best advice is, first of all, if control is your goal, then you will never get to rest. You will never have any kind of rest at all because you'll have to constantly be in control all the time. It's the same as and that's why looking at ourselves as a relationship is the best way to look at least that's mine. I think it is so helpful for my clients, for myself. So, okay, instead of looking at it, because that specific position is coming from still identifying ourselves as the conscious thinking part of ourselves, and we don't identify ourselves as a relationship. It's still, I'm trying to control myself, right? So I would invite you, let's just take a minute to just consider, and let me give you an idea of what the team looks like, right? Because if that's in the language of breath, we have all these things that we bring up. And one of the tenets of the language of breath is that the healthiest you is a team, right? So if you think about this, there's the conscious you and the unconscious you. And you can process, like I was saying, at all times, we are processing 11 million pieces of information. You can only process about 40 to 50 pieces of information consciously. And if you think about that, that's where you max out. Let's suppose you're maxing out conscious awareness as 50 pieces of information. Well, let me tell you about your conscious and your unconscious. So the conscious you that's the part of you that's capable of critical thinking. And it's a very important part of the team, right? It's capable of thinking about the future. It's capable of thinking about the past. It understands the difference between the now and the later and the previous and all those things. It's capable of doing slow, critical, methodical thought, which is very important. But this is also a very slow process that's very limited. We know we can really only focus consciously on one thing at a time and do it well. We try to multitask, but it just, that just doesn't really work. And so that is what your conscious thinking self can do. It's very awesome. And it's stuff that the unconscious you cannot do. But let me tell you about your unconscious you and why we want to make that part of ourselves our friend. So first and foremost, just say, okay, I'm just going to decide that my unconscious is my friend. It is pushing you probably to negative actions and positive ones. So it's pushing you, it's affecting all of your actions in ways that you don't fully have awareness of. But let me tell you about that part of yourself. First of all, this part of you is capable of processing enormous amounts of information pretty much instantaneously, from everything you've ever learned or experienced in your entire life to everything that you're experiencing now, all at once. It's capable of processing those things so fast, in fact, that it will send emotional signals to your conscious awareness before you can even consciously be aware of the situation that it's already made a decision about. It's a fantastic friend, and it's in what it does for anytime you've ever had a gut feeling, anytime you've ever had intuition, that was your unconscious speaking to you. And it was processing like enormous amounts of information from all throughout your life. And it says, based off of everything I've ever experienced, this is the truth of the here and now. So it's an incredible friend. It's a very good partner that we want to partner with. And in fact, you could not, like when people talk about uploading their consciousness to like some kind of a machine or whatever, I don't really know how that would work. Unless you're able to upload the unconscious too. And I don't think anybody really understands how that works yet. So we want this part of ourselves. Now, having said that, the unconscious you, it does not have the ability to know the difference between the future and the past. It's experiencing everything in the present. And this is why a lot of mindfulness practices focus on trying to be in the present, because whenever you consciously are aware of the present, and that's whenever you're less likely to ruminate. And rumination, what you were describing, I'm with you, brother. I've been a ruminator my whole life. And I think a lot of people in the world of business and in sport, a lot of high performers understand that 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock in the morning is often a time when we wake up and we worry about things that we can do nothing about right now. Having said that, why does that happen? It's because the conscious you, which is capable of thinking about something that's going to happen tomorrow. So for instance, okay, maybe it's the middle of the night and I'm a little worried about the meeting that I'm going to have, or maybe I'm worried about the jiu-jitsu competition the next day. Well, I'm thinking about it consciously. And what that does is it notifies my unconscious. My unconscious says, jiu-jitsu tournament? We need energy for that. So it starts to make physiological changes and emotional changes in that moment, because it's not capable of understanding that is not the present moment. It's always living in the present. And so what we often will experience, and this is just one of the many things we work on in the language of breath, is how to help this team get back on track. Because what happens here, it's a misunderstanding within the team, right? This part of you that loves you very much, this unconscious part of you that you need, it's in charge of your physiological responses. It gives you energy. It's the part of you that you train. So for the jiu-jitsu competitor or whatever, like the athlete, that's the part of you that if you can let that part of you take over, that's what we call the zone. Like whenever we say I was too much in my head, right? Of course, another metaphor. That means what happens is when we choke, like when athletes choke, it's typically because we should be in letting our unconscious take over. That's where the training lives. You can't hold that in your conscious awareness, because imagine you have this slow, but it's very methodical and critical thinking, but it's slow. And you're trying to do all these complex motions and movements using that part of your consciousness. No, you want the unconscious to be there. And so how do we use the part of the team that's best suited for the situation? That's the language of breath, because we love both parts of ourselves. And we should, that's another reason why we don't want to see ourselves as a machine, right? I'm the mind and I take care of this body that's my machine. Well, you do that to a Buick. Maybe you like your car or whatever and you take good care of it, but you don't see it as yourself. You have to see the unconscious as you. It's actually more you than the conscious you. And the very fact that you're worried about the conscious you not having full control, that's actually coming from the unconscious you. It's this funny thing about ourselves, because that unconscious you cares, and it's giving you an emotional signal that, hey, well, maybe we're out of control. I'm pretty sure I need control. I've been told that my whole life. I need control. So we need to worry about this. And so learning the language of breath is more than just about learning breathing techniques and having, peak experiences. It's about the peak experience of every single moment of your life, understanding that every single moment we have is lived through this team, this relationship. And so we have to understand, once we understand how this relationship works, we can start to understand how to interface with it so that we can say, okay, this is the part of the team I need to use now. How do I get that part of the team to understand the reality of the moment? And so it's important to understand that you are you. And when I hear people talk about, being myself, you're really never not yourself unless you're like even the part of you that makes you behave differently than maybe you would want to behave. It's acting that way because your unconscious believes that that's the best thing for your survival right now. And so it's a deeper, we have to look at ourselves deeper than so often in this space. We get a lot of tag words, and we get a lot of things that a lot of people, hey, true self, I want to be my true self. And that sounds good. And it is a good thing. But when you understand that you are your true self, no matter what you do, that is you being you, even if you're behaving in a way that you don't want to behave, that's because a part of you believes that that's the best thing for you. Now, if that's something you don't want to do anymore, if you want to be able to speak back into that relationship that I want to behave in a different way, and this is where we can start to really make major changes in our daily lives, then we start to recognize those things, and we can start to use breath and self-awareness to make that team say, okay, well, I don't have to feel so uncomfortable anymore. I don't have to feel unsafe. I can feel safe behaving in a way that is actually within my moral set, that I consciously am aware of. I want to behave this way. So I need to communicate safety in behaving that way to my unconscious. And we can do that using our breath and self-awareness. I know this is sounding really maybe super nerdy, but I warned you early on that that's what I am.
Well, Jesse, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a pleasure, learned so much. And just there helping me to kind of understand the fact that actually, that part of me that is kind of so worried about like the unconscious part is actually part of my subconscious as well. And just I never thought about that in that way before. And so, thank you for that. I want to give you a chance to share where people can go to learn more about your work, your book, the Breathwork classes you run. Where can people go if they want to stay in touch with everything that you've got going on?
Yeah, so you can go to jessecoomer.com, or you can go to languageofbreathcollective.com, and you can find out more about my books. The online course is the Language of Breath online course. It's a 6-week deep dive into how all of this works, and it takes you step by step. This is not a course that's just like if you want to learn a few breathing techniques. This is a very deep dive into how this system works. And then we do have a teacher training that we are now taking applications for. This is the 2025 class. We just completed the 2024 class, and it was awesome. That was our 3rd class, and we're continuing to grow every year. But if you'd like to learn how to offer this to your clients, go to languageofbreathcollective.com or jessecoomer.com, and there's a place where you can put in an application. You can also schedule a brief meeting with me to make sure that you're the right fit for our program. And we will be doing our certification starting in April next year. We do a hybrid program. So some of it is we have some prerequisites. So you read the book, you take the course, and then we do live Zoom calls. You get about 30 hours of Zoom instruction, and then we do an in-person retreat. It's just always a ton of fun, but we do a ton of learning, hands-on learning. So when we send you out there, not only are you capable of helping people with using this language breath philosophy, we teach you business concepts, how you can help the world while also making a good living at the same time. So that is languageofbreathcollective.com or jessecoomer.com. And if you'd like to find me on Instagram, you can find me at Jesse Coomer Breath. And lastly, if you just want to kind of dip your toes, maybe it's something I just want to dip my toes in what Jesse does with Language of Breath. I do also have a Patreon club, and it's called the Breath Club on Patreon. And it's going by an older name that I used to use. It was Midwestern Method, because I am from the Midwest of the United States. And you just go to Patreon and look for the Breath Club with Jesse Coomer, and you will find me.
Excellent. Well, I'll link that all down below. Jesse, thank you for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I hope that you've enjoyed my conversation with Jesse Coomer. I had a blast. Talking to Jesse and exploring breath work. I love the metaphors that he shared that can help us understand our relationship with the breath and breath work, etc., and hope that you found that too. In fact, I would love to know the part of this conversation with Jesse that stood out to you the most. Feel free to leave a comment below this video if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're listening on the podcast, actually over on Spotify, in particular on Spotify, then you can leave a comment there now on that platform. So please do just that. I read all comments and reply as well. So I'd love to know what you got from this episode. We've covered breathwork a few times on the podcast, and we'll continue to do so through different lenses, through different angles. And today's angle was definitely different to what we've covered before. So I'd love to know what you got from this conversation with Jesse. All of his links are in the show notes, so head on over and connect with Jesse. I love following him actually over on LinkedIn. He shares a lot of good stuff. And if you would like Jesse to come back onto the podcast then also let me know as well, because a lot of his work is how breathwork can help our performance, which we didn't really dive into in depth in this episode, mostly exploring the subconscious, unconscious, and conscious minds and its relationship with breathwork. So if that's something that you would gain value in, let me know about that as well. And I will read all comments. And if that's something that you want, we'll get it done. Without further ado, thank you for tuning into this episode. If you haven't already subscribed, hit that subscribe button so you get updates when new episodes go live. And I look forward to talking to you, seeing you in the next episode.